Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Milan. I've met some of you today. I'm with the Children in Nature Network, and we are thrilled to have you here tonight for our virtual Trailside chat, which will feature Richard Louv, who is, of course, a renowned author, the author of literally the book. He wrote the book about the Children in Nature movement, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, and co-founder of the Children in Nature Network, and serves today in many roles, including board chair emeritus, and supports a lot of our work when we think about sharing stories and editorial, and he'll be really actively involved in a new news website that will be launching very soon. And joining Richard is Laura Turner Seydel, who I'm sure is familiar to many of you for her international work on climate action and environmental activism. She is the chair of the Captain Planet Foundation, and she is also a C&NN board member. And we're really thrilled that she's been able to join us. She brings a very really strong background of work in the conservation field, and we're thrilled to have her on the board and thrilled to have her here tonight. And with that, I'm really just going to hand this over to Laura and Rich. Laura will sort of kind of throw out some questions that we think you would all be interested in hearing Rich respond to. Then they're going to have a chat, and at about the half hour, maybe 35-minute mark, we're going to open it up to questions from all of you. Please use the chat to connect with each other and share thoughts and resources. But when you want to ask a question of Laura and Rich during that Q&A, I think you probably all got this Zoom drill down, but on the bottom toolbar, over towards the right, there's a Q&A icon. Click on that, enter your question, and Laura will be able to see those. And I doubt we'll be able to get to all of them, but we will sure try. And we do have a little bit of extra time padded in here in case this conversation is really rocking. We won't have to cut us off right at an hour. We're excited about that. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laura, Rich, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this virtual Trailside chat. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Laura, and hi, Rich.
Laura.
Thank you
Laura,
for
Laura S, Laura M, and Laura S.
Right, there are two of us, but I just wanted to tell you how excited I am about this Trailside chat with the great, iconic leader of the Children in Nature movement, Rich. That's you. You are a superhero for Earth. In fact, I gave you that award back in November, and that was truly an honor for me. Your book, the Handbook for the Children in Nature movement, which you also co-founded the Children in Nature Network organization that we all know and love. But you wrote that book, published that book in 2005, 15 years ago. And since then, some of my favorite books, Vitamin N, your Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, obviously your new book, Our Wild Calling, How Connecting with Animals Can Transform Our Lives and Save Theirs. And I've read 4 of your articles at bedtime last night. You're so prolific. You're so sought out as a national, international journalist. And you sit on a mountaintop of information. You've been doing this for a long time. And I just, I'm sure everybody wants to hear, over the course of a decade and a half, how have things changed on the Children in Nature front, in this landscape that you've created? How has your thinking changed along with it? Please let us know. Inquiring minds want to know.
Well, first, Laura, as you know, you're one of my heroes, as is your father. And you're kind of a Renaissance person, just like he is. So I really appreciate that. and also want to thank Sarah and the organizers of this. This is very hard to do, a virtual conference. And I'm still mastering the technology here myself, and I'm a little slow at it, but I've had a great time. I mean, in the breakout rooms and listening to the speeches. I think we had, with camera, we had the best keynote yet in any of our conferences, better than mine for sure. And I was very moved by it. I've been very fascinated in the breakout sessions. And I said in one of the recent breakout sessions I was in, one of the things that impresses me that every year the discussion gets more sophisticated. The people who attend the conferences have more and more knowledge of the field, of the integration of all of these fields that touch on children and nature. And it humbles me because Laura Milan, it suggests that there are 1,000 stories that need to be written about 1,000 topics, new aspects of this movement, and we need to get busy. And it's gone way, way beyond my ability to track it. So, in terms of the changes, well, first off is the emergence of a movement, which I thought I wrote about in Last Child, in the end of The Last Child, as a kind of wishful thinking. And then people like Amy Perchek and Martin LeBlanc came to my rescue because suddenly people wanted to do something. And I had only imagined that. And that's where the Children Nature Network came from. And Amy's father, too, with whom I had worked, Mike Perchek. So that has grown. It's grown internationally. I think it pre-existed us, but I don't think it was some of the leaders in this were getting the credit that they deserved. And I think now they're far more visible. One of the big changes is that the massive growth in research. When I wrote Last Child, I could find, I think I counted at one time, about 60 studies. 60 studies on either the disconnect, but in particular the benefits of nature for health, for physical, psychological health, cognitive functioning, ability to learn and create. I could only find about 60 studies, which was astounding to me, that something this large, a question this large, how does the exposure to the natural world shape us as human beings, beginning in childhood? It had been pretty much ignored, except for a few very amazing pioneers in the academic world. Now, if you go to the Children Nature Network, the research page, which I think many of you have gone to, one of the reasons we created this was so we could continue to collect in one place all the research that was starting to bloom. Now there's over 1,000 studies, and they're coming in 10, 15, 20 a month. Kathy Jordan at the University of Minnesota is doing a great job of compiling those. We brought that research, a lot of it in independently done abstracts out from behind the firewall. Too much of this research is behind firewalls that you have to pay a lot of money to read that journal. That's an issue with the academic world that somebody needs to address sometime. So much of that research was done with public money, and yet it's not available to the public unless they can pay big bucks. So we've tried to bring that out. We are very conservative about how this research is described. The abstracts are independently done from us. So that's been an amazing thing. The mainstream health professionals are really paying attention to this. Some of them are at this conference. They're either prescribing nature now, or they're incorporating it into their work in different ways. And that's a big change. We're moving into urban issues. and the design of programs of the physical environment. Our partnership at Children Nature Network's partnership with the National League of Cities is significant because they are actually working with mayors. They represent about 18,000 mayors in the United States, and they're working with some target cities to start to figure out, A, what is a nature-rich city? What does it look like? B, how do we track the evidence of that over time? And C, how do we train future mayors and other municipal leaders to make their cities nature-rich? And not just for the people who can afford, REI equipment, as much as I love REI, but for everybody, no matter who they are, no matter what their set of abilities, no matter what their race or their ethnic background, or whether they're immigrants or not. This has to be for everyone. And that has a lot to do with how two things are designed. One, the physical fact of the city, the physical buildings, the layout of it, but it's also the design of the human network that holds that city together. The agencies, the nonprofits, the churches, the synagogues, all of that is part of the design of cities, of nature-rich cities. So I think we're making progress on that. Nature-based education has made some big strides. Nature-based preschools in particular have really increased at an exponential rate. That's good news, even though there are a lot of barriers still in education that have to be attended. And then, of course, the focus of Camera and so many of the people who've spoken so far, the whole issue of equity. We're just, we focused on that from the beginning, but not to the degree that is being focused on now through Sarah Milligan-Toffler's and others' leadership. The whole issue of racism. Clearly, that is an area we have a lot of ways to go in terms of progress.
Well, there's so much to be grateful for. And, like you said, there's so much information that's so critically important to be able to advocate with city councils and local political leaders on making sure that we have the green space, that it's safe and inviting and accessible for everybody. And, that's part of, so much a part of what I'm passionate about. In Atlanta, for instance, we're really getting going, and we were supposed to be hosting this conference there, but hopefully we'll be able to meet in person next time around. But hopefully we'll have legislation that will make nature, a priority for communities in Atlanta, and we're taking a page out of the playbook of what New Mexico is doing, and some of the other cities, I guess Albuquerque in New Mexico, but also the 1,000 studies that you say now are available for anybody to see on your website. I guess 300 of them are related to mental health in the developing brain, and so important in this time of crises, from COVID to climate, the weather disasters that we're seeing, the extremes across the country, from the hurricanes and the fires and the derechos in the Midwest that destroyed 10 million acres of food crops just recently. Even if you're not living in the middle of it, these climate-related events, you're certainly witnessing it. And I just think the amount of chronic stress, anxiety, this is a huge topic related to depression and suicide, is something that we have to tackle as a community. But what is the silver lining of COVID-19, a global pandemic? And for me, it's that people are getting out in nature. They want it, they need it, they're reconnecting at a time that children are, pre-pandemic, they were sick. More than half of our children, according to the HHS, Health and Human Services, have a chronic disease. 8 hours a day in front of a screen, diabetes and obesity, ADHD, obviously mental health issues. And, we know how nature is so incredibly healing, and that their parents are getting them out, they're getting into parks, they're getting into the green spaces, their yards, their neighborhoods, and reconnecting, all at the same time that they are witnessing firsthand or secondhand what's going on with the climate crisis. And, my question is, what we're professing, what we're doing, this desire to be in nature, create a reason for action on climate? And I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Well, first, in many of the comments that I've listened to in the breakout sessions, the word trauma keeps coming up. And trauma because of climate change, the anxiety that brings, trauma because of racism, trauma because of the inaccessibility of healthcare to so many people economically. And now the trauma of the pandemic, which is related to climate change directly. It's related, as Jane Goodall says, to how we treat other animals, how we treat wildlife. There's a direct connection, apparently, between the spread of the coronavirus and where it came from. And so it's not going to be the last pandemic, because we're continuing to destroy physical habitat for wildlife, continuing to use them in ways that is not healthy, certainly not for them and not for us either. So this trauma is going to continue. And part of that trauma, by the way, is, let me reframe this. The pandemic is also an incredible learning opportunity. One of the things most of us have noted is how the media, at least, and many of the people we know and ourselves are suddenly looking out the window. We're realizing there's nature right there, that it's not an abstraction, that you don't, you don't know what you got till it's gone. You don't know, what you have until the parks are closed, or they're now overcrowded because of people's hunger for nature. But one of the things that's happened, and Laura Mylan has done a great job with findingnature.org, is that people are realizing it's in their yard, it's on their roof, it's on the balcony across the busy city street, and they're beginning to notice it more. They're also realizing how hungry they are for it. They're also really realizing, I think, how medicinal it is for their trauma, particularly their psychological trauma. We'll get into this later, but the whole issue of species loneliness is part of this. And it's also helping people understand, when they look around and they realize how incredibly important that park is to them near their house. They're realizing that the parks near other people's houses are not accessible, or not as accessible, or they simply don't exist. And if they do, there are other barriers of race, barriers to people with disabilities. There's all kinds of barriers. So it's making a lot of people who weren't really aware of how important nature was to them. It makes them aware of that, and it's making them aware of the inequity of the availability of natural surroundings to a lot of people. We've heard quite a bit recently from city designers who are beginning to rethink how they're going to design new neighborhoods, but also redesign old neighborhoods to get more nature into them. They've gotten the message, a lot of them. That's the silver lining of the pandemic. The trauma is the thing that we need to attend to. And let me add that one of the things I'm worried about is that as this yearning, deep, deep yearning for nature, the connecting of nature to our sense of trauma as a people, but as individuals, as that's grown, it builds up a real tension. It's like a slingshot. You pull that slingshot, bam, back far enough. Sooner or later, I hope, the pandemic will end, or at least take a break, and we'll let go of that slingshot. And everybody will head, even more than they already are, to the parks, to nature. One of the questions is, when that happens, all of these great programs that connect people to nature, particularly kids from neighborhoods that they don't have much contact with nature. And these programs have been giving them that contact through summer camps, through special programs for special needs kids, all of that. Will those programs exist given the economy and the changes that are coming? When the hunger is greatest, as this pandemic, I hope, takes a break, will those programs exist? We need to really look at how we can help those programs now financially, rather than looking around 3 months or 6 months from now and realizing they're gone.
I do think that, it's so incredibly sensible and necessary that we heal people with exposure to nature. We know it works, and the trauma you refer to is we've got to deal with it. And animal therapy, art therapy, nature therapy is critical. But we have a climate crisis, and from my perspective, we really have to make sure that we're protecting our children's health, their quality of life, and their future. And there won't be a future unless we address it head on. And we've got leadership in this country. We've got 130 congressional members that are outspoken, on climate. They're climate deniers, that it's man-made and that we need to do something about it. And in fact, there are $700 billion of perks going to the oil industry. And from taxpayer dollars, 700 billion, when we need to be moving to a clean energy economy and renewable energy that keeps our air clean, that our children breathe clean air and not harm their little lungs that are developing permanently, and focus on a lot of these other issues. But the smartest scientists in the world, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have said we have about a decade to take serious action. And if our leaders won't change, we have to change our leaders, because our children will hold us accountable. There are millions of children in this country and around the world that have said, vote for our future. And, it's the 900-pound gorilla in the room, but it's absolutely critical. We can, restore nature and, do all this wonderful work to make it available, accessible, equitable. But if it burns up like it has in California, 3 million acres, most of it wilderness, gone. And all those animals gone. We're in the middle of a species extinction. I don't want to get wrapped up in gloom and doom, because there's so many reasons to be hopeful. And Richard, I want you to tell us about that now. Move from despair to hope, from inaction to action.
Well, first, the fundamental goal of the Children of Nature movement is to connect children and their families and their communities to nature in a way that is not abstract, that is heartfelt, that is personal, that is in fact about love. If we don't do that, then nature remains an abstraction, climate change remains an abstraction. We don't notice the animals going past our house that stopped coming past our house because of the change of climate. We simply, it's very difficult to care about anything you don't love, and it's very difficult to love anything that you don't have personal connection with. It's one of the reasons that I've written recently this book about our connection to other animals. There's a guy in Australia, Glenn Albrecht, he's a philosopher that I've quoted often. And I wrote a piece for REI, actually, for their website a few months ago. And I was struck by watching all those images of Australians who had just lost their own houses to fire, rush into the fire itself and save animals, particularly koalas. It was so moving to watch that. And I asked Glenn Albrecht about that, and he said, you know, all of the movements that are the most successful at actually changing things, they're not about statistics, they're not about data, as important as data is. They're about love, they're about relationship, civil rights, feminism, gay rights. Those are all about relationship, ultimately about love. That is at the core, I think, of the work of so many people that come to our conferences. Ultimately, their work is about love, love of the planet, love of other creatures, love of other people. And so often that gets lost in not by us, but certainly by my fellow journalists, in the haze of statistics and data. As important as that is, ultimately data doesn't change things. Love does, relationship does. That's one of the reasons why what we do is so important. What we do is also so important because I said for a long time, I hope this is still true, that the disconnection and the reconnection of children to the natural world may be the last issue that we can get people into the same room, maybe even to the same table, who don't want to be in the same room. It's one of the last things that will bring people together across political and religious divides. I hope that is still true. The second thing I would say is that we can't see these things in isolation. We can't see climate change, for instance, in isolation. I like to talk about the four, sometimes I say five, horsemen of the apocalypse that are all riding together. One is the climate challenge. One is biodiversity collapse. One is the growth of human loneliness, which is now up there with obesity and smoking as a cause of early death. And I'm trying to think of what the fourth one is.
Loss of species, the species extinction.
Well, I said biodiversity collapse, but also extinction. I should have those in my mind. But they're all related, and we have to look for multi-solutions that work for all of them. For instance, planting vast and very diverse forests, not like the typical forestry forest, but diverse forests. Doing that reduces the carbon in the air. These are carbon absorption forests. It provides connection to nature for human beings. It brings us out of our species loneliness. Um, and it deals with all of those issues that I just said. It deals with extinction. It deals with biodiversity collapse. If we change our cities so that the cities are no longer the enemy of biodiversity, but the incubator of biodiversity, that is a multi-solution. It makes life better for the children of all critters. Having said that, who's going to do that? We have to, I think, put jobs farther ahead in our agenda. We have to change the definition of green jobs. Green jobs, it's not only about solar panels. That's how most people think of it, at least most Americans or many Americans. It's also about the preschool teacher at the nature-based preschool. That's a green job. The people who are at this conference, they're all in some kind of green job. It may not be technological like so many of them are described, but it's still a green job. And then we have to figure out how to train people, bring people, particularly people from diverse backgrounds, racial backgrounds, economic backgrounds, ethnic, immigration backgrounds, to those jobs. It's one of the reasons why the Green New Deal, even if it takes place with a different name, is so important, because it says we need to get to work. And a generation of millennials is waiting to be hired to do that, to have good work, to have work they're proud of. And the kids coming up younger than them, that is part of the connection to nature too, is having jobs for people to heal the planet.
And, you know, the topic of discussion and focus everywhere, there's so many conferences going on right now, Climate Week, for Climate Week. And the focus is regeneration, restoration, whether it's regenerative agriculture, regenerative grazing. And as you said, there's so many win-win-wins. Drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it back into the ground, bringing the life back in the soil, making it more resistant to drought, grows healthier food. It's more humane for the animals. There are a couple of really great films. The Biggest Little Farm is one. Kiss the Ground is premiering on Netflix tonight, which is focused on soil regeneration. And I just think that you are on it because you're always talking about, how we're going to combat loneliness. And I just think that what you've written about, what you've researched, what you've gone around the world and done in interviewing, hundreds, if not thousands of people in your career, and sharing these really important stories is so heartwarming, and it is habitat of the heart. And I know too that what is healing is when people and their children get out in nature and they plant in a garden and they help restore habitat. And a lot of that is going to have to happen because we've lost a tremendous amount of habitat, with the fires and the derechos and the flooding from the hurricanes. And when you pitch in, when you lean in and you do something to help someone or something else, be it an animal or pollinators or whatever, it makes you feel like you've made a difference, you've contributed. And it's a great way to combat depression, for instance. But I know, would you like to say anything about the regeneration and restoration?
Yeah. First, I want to mention Tom Rosenberg said something really interesting in the comments. He said that America's overnight camps, over 15,000 nationwide, serving over 26 million children in normal times, only 18% of overnight camps operated this past summer. That speaks to that urgency that I was trying to express about, not falling back, not allowing these wonderful programs to go under, because they often serve the kids who most need them, and are most unlikely to have nature in their lives. The regenerative, the approach to that, biophilic design suggests that cities can be redesigned, buildings, workplaces, schools, our homes can be even redesigned or brought up to a point where biophilic design is part of them. And what that means is that weaving nature into them so that we are exposed to nature no matter how dense the neighborhood is. We can be more exposed to nature, and that is largely a design issue, and it doesn't only happen in the parks. And that's sometimes called regenerative design. Regenerative agriculture is increasingly popular. I just read something about regenerative grazing. Now, I know that cattle are part of the problem in all of that, but setting that aside for a minute, regenerative grazing is stopping the way that cattle are grazed now, which is they're spread out over a big area. And there's something about that is really bad for the ecology on which they graze. The way that most grazing animals in natural settings, like bison and so forth, the way they graze together. They graze, they march across a big field and big prairie, and they stay together. And so it's a little bit like rotating crops. They just go this one strip. And as they go on that one strip, their hooves are digging up the earth. Their manure is fertilizing it. And it ends up being more fertile for growing prairie grasses than, later on. And meanwhile, the other land has been left intact until next year. That's a very different way to think about these things. And getting back to those kind of natural practices is much of what regenerative architecture, regenerative agriculture is about. We can regenerate nature. One of the phrases that I use in the nature principle is conservation is no longer enough. Now we need to create nature. As strange as that sounds, we need to create new kinds of cities. And that can be done. And that's part of the new jobs that could emerge for young people.
Hear, hear. I have some great questions coming in from your fans. Here's one from Diana. What other topics, like your book, need to be written to fill in the space around children and nature? What are the gaps in book topics, in your opinion?
I'm trying not to think about new books right now. But others, there are a lot of books out there now on this that are quite impressive, many of them, and we need more. I mentioned up front that one of the things I'm humbled by this conference is the people in the breakout session that are bringing up all kinds of issues that I haven't thought about, and that need, if not books, they need research. One of the questions is, how much progress are we making? Are we keeping up with the barriers, or are we continuing to fall behind? We can't get too self-congratulatory about this. One of the areas that I think needs a lot more attention is our relationship with wildlife, wild animals. And one of the reasons that I wrote Our Wild Calling is because I looked at our research library, and so much, almost all of it, of the research is focused on green space. And that's terrific. We need to think about green space. But a coyote walks through your backyard and changes you when you have eye contact with it. Very little is known about how our encounters with wildlife, our relationship with wildlife nurtures us, changes us. You know, it nurtures our spirit. We know quite a bit about domestic animals. That's one of the reasons why animal-assisted therapy is one of the fastest growing therapeutic areas in the country. But that's mainly domesticated animals. But what about those? Well, and just to tell you a brief story to illustrate this idea, the habitat of the heart, which I think is part of the new frontier of environmentalism and of our movement in particular. I collected a lot of stories from people about these encounters they have with wild animals, as well as their pets. And many of them are deeply moving, and there are common denominators among them. One of them is what happens when we have an encounter with a wild animal. We go into one of several altered states, as I describe it. Time disappears or bends. This, I think, affects us deeply, possibly almost most of all at a spiritual level. I tell a lot of stories, or people in the book tell a lot of stories about those encounters. There's an oceanographer who describes how he was wrapped up in a giant octopus at the bottom of the Pacific, and he thought he was going to die. He ran out of air right then, but he relaxed, the octopus relaxed. They started going up in the column of water together, and as they went up, he could feel the sharp beak of the octopus coming around his neck until he was looking right into the octopus's eye. And something happened in those moments. This is a hardcore, he's at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He's a hardcore, famous oceanographer among oceanographers. He's in his 80s now. And he said something happened in those seconds that he can't explain. The way he puts it, kind of tongue-in-cheek, is we made our non-aggression pact. As they went up, he was out of air, and at that moment, they broke the surface. He ripped off his mask. He's looking down into the water, and the octopus is still there, and they still have eye contact. And then he sees the octopus start to disappear down into the darkness. And what does Paul Dayton do then? This is the best part of his story, I think. He puts his mask back on and he dives after the octopus and chases it as far as he can. And as they go down, they're kind of doing a spiral around each other. When he talks about that, he says that he was a student in college when that, he said it changed his whole life. I heard, and he doesn't have the words to describe it. I heard stories like that again and again. I tell a story of my own, which is one day I was out on a lake near San Diego. I have a little boat with an electric motor, and I saw on the shore what I thought were two vultures. They were not vultures because I came up to them real quietly, 20 feet away. They were two giant golden eagles. And so for a long time, seemed like forever, remember that altered state of time disappearing or bending. Paul, by the way, experienced that. For a long time, I watched them. I went back and forth, and they would do this. They would bend down, take a bite of the fish, and then look up at me. Bend down, take a bite. This went on for what seemed like forever. In those seconds, I felt what Paul felt, and so many of the people who tell these stories felt. Something changed. And where it was between me and the eagles. I can't talk for the eagles. They may have just been trying to decide if I was edible. I'm not sure it was in me. It was between us. And what is that people feel that's between them and another animal when they have an encounter or an extended relationship? What is that? That's the question of the book. I think that's a fundamental question that children kind of get, but we lose that as we become adults. The closest I could come to it is a great philosopher, Martin Buber, I always have to be careful not to say Justin Bieber, but Martin Buber wrote this great essay called I and Thou. And he said, Laura, that you and I don't actually exist. Not really. What exists is between us. It's a relationship. And he meant that in a different way that we usually use relationship. He thought of it as a kind of electricity that some people call God. What happens when we lose that habitat? In the book, I named that. We don't have a name for that with animals. He was talking about people. And so in the book, I call that the habitat of the heart. That there are two habitats. One is the physical habitat that we've talked a lot about today, that we do a lot to try to protect. The other habitat is the habitat of the heart, and we do hardly anything to protect and nurture and grow the habitat of the heart. But here's the deal. If one of those habitats goes, so does the other one. The Children of Nature movement, at its core, is about the habitat of the heart. Yes, it's about the physical habitat, but it's about that connection, that inexplicable few seconds. When I went back, when I had that experience with the Eagles, I told my younger son, who was home from college that weekend, I told him about this. I said, you know, something changed there. I don't know what it is. I don't want to sound too new agey or anything like this, but something changed. I don't have the words to describe that. I said, Matthew, whoever I say I am, I'm not. Whoever I really am is who I was in those endless minutes with the Eagles. This is primal. This is a connection that predates human language, verbal language for sure. And I think that that is rediscovering that habitat is at the core of the future of the Children of Nature movement, and it's at the core of the environmental and conservation movement.
Wow. Just absolutely amazing. You just continue to inspire me, and I'm sure your fans are just blown away. I have another question, though, kind of shifting gears briefly. What do you think is needed to truly change the conversation within school districts in order for them to install meaningful, holistic, and widespread outdoor education?
You know, I wrote a piece recently, and I have a blog on the site. In addition to my Children of Nature Network blog, I have one in Psychology Today. And I wrote about my brother. My brother is a high school teacher in Fortuna, California. He lives in Eureka, which is nearby. It's in the northern corner of California. And he was told a month ago that he needed to go back to school as a teacher. And my brother is 65. He's had heart surgery. He's vulnerable. But he is deeply committed to his students. He walked into the school and the desks were 3 feet apart. The windows could not be open more than 8 or 10 inches. He was being asked to risk his life and risk those children's lives and their families' lives without much explanation and with no real plan to help him do that. No discussion at that school about tents outside the building, where kids could spread out, no discussion about outdoor classrooms being part of the solution. Something we knew in 1915 in the tuberculosis epidemic. They had outdoor classrooms on the roofs of buildings in Manhattan in 1915 because they knew the kids needed to be farther apart. And it worked. There's no plan. There's no plan to do this. I talked to a guy, and I'll get to the question, but I talked to a guy the other day who's working at a PBS station in Denver. And he said they're trying to figure that out too for a series. And they've gone to the schools, and the schools don't want to talk about this related to COVID. And his conclusion is the same one I heard in one of the breakout sessions, which is agencies don't want to talk to agencies. Schools are separated from parks. We're all still in our silos, so there's no plan. Nationally, statewide, or locally. Some places are different, but generally there's no plan to help these kids go back to school. It's not just a question of going back to school or staying at home. There has to be a way to do it. And outdoor classrooms are essential to thinking that through. And this isn't going to go away soon. It's not the last pandemic. So I hope that the pandemic begins to get schools and educators who haven't thought about the cognitive benefits and the health benefits of learning outdoors to start thinking about that. We need to do a much better job of spreading the research. But again, you know, it's not just the research, it's not just the data. We have to express this in different ways. We have to ask ourselves whether we really love our children as a culture and whether we really love nature. And I hope my brother is okay. I'm going to call him tonight.
Well, you know, I just, in my own work, have experienced, you know, the excitement when children get outside and experience that wonder and awe that you very often write about, and how it's so important for those children to have that experience. And just gardening with young children, they're so afraid of dirt, germs, bugs, and eating vegetables. And they get over it so fast. If you just slow down and, you know, engage with them. And I've never seen children so fascinated, and it is heartwarming when they hold a little earthworm in their hand and they're trying to find the little itty bitty mouth. And then they're breaking up a little bit of food to fit it in their mouth. And, you know, it's so absolutely critical that we start with the basics and, you know, really, because we're raising kids that are terrified of nature. They have Shark Week and Snake Week and Grizzly Bear Week and all these weeks, and big cats, and they're terrified of it. Bees and bugs, and we just have to get beyond it. One of my, and I don't know if you had a chance to watch the movie Social Dilemma, Jeff Orlowski's new documentary film, but every person should watch this. Any person that has a cell phone or a online social media platform, because you will be shocked and mortified how your children's eyeballs are worth money to an advertiser someplace, and they're being totally manipulated and made addicted to these platforms, to their cellular devices. And we need to know the truth. We're already saying that 5 to 8 hours a day is too much. And Rich, you talk about there needing to be balance, that balance between being indoors and on screens and then being out in nature. Why don't you elaborate just a few minutes about that?
Well, first, this territory is a little bit tricky because the minute adults demonize anything, kids want more of it. And so for a practical purpose, if nothing else, we need to be careful not to demonize video games and the rest. The word is balance. One of the bumper sticker phrases in my books in the nature principle is the more high-tech our lives become, the more nature we need. It's a budgeting issue of time and money. The more high-tech our schools become, and they will be more high-tech, the more nature students need, the more time spent in natural school yards of learning areas that are not concrete and asphalt, but are made of are filled with gardens and connections to wildlife and all of that. We have to balance that. So as technology becomes more of a part of life, we have to do even more to connect people to nature. We have to stay ahead of that. So I'm going to watch that document. There's another one on Netflix people have been telling me to watch, and it's about my teacher, the octopus. They've reminded me that I have that story in the book about the octopus. Sounds like something I need to watch.
Well, I've got a few more questions that have come in, and I'd like to get to them if we can. What is the most effective way you have found to get your message across to policymakers and others who have power and make decisions?
By building the constituency that will go to their office. You know, again, data doesn't do it. You can show them all the studies in the world, and most of them will not, some of them will, but most of them will not act on the data. Quite a few years ago, I was invited to be the keynote speaker to the very first environmental education summit at the White House. It's when Obama was president. And I went there and realized that I'd been asked to do that right after the Obama administration, of all administrations, had cut a lot of money out of the federal budget for environmental education. So I thought, oh my God, I've been set up as the apologist. And so I got there, and fortunately, they switched things around. They made the Secretary of Education the opening keynote and me the ending keynote. And that was good because they sacrificed the Secretary of Education to 150 really ticked off environmental educator leaders. But that gave me a little time to think about this in terms of how do we make that change? And so when I spoke, I said the very politically incorrect thing, or environmentally incorrect thing, is, you know, I was thinking about the movie Jaws this morning and last night. Remember that moment and I know that's not environmentally correct, and I don't care, I really like that movie. When they get to the point in the movie and in the book where the sheriff on the boat has that confrontation with the big shark, and he says, we need a bigger boat. Right now, we need a bigger boat. And what I said to the environmental educators is, you know, maybe gratuitously, as long as you guys only talk to environmental educators, you lose. As long as environmentalists only talk to environmentalists, people agree with them, you lose. As long as teachers only talk to teachers, you lose. One of the powers of the Children of Nature issue is that it brings people into the same room from different silos who don't necessarily want to be there. So often, and it was mentioned in one of the breakout things that I was in, people doing wonderful work look at each other depending on what agency or NGO they're in, and they worry about their funding. That if they work with that other agency, they're going to maybe lose some of their traction in getting funding. The only real answer to that is we need a bigger boat. We need to build a constituency and build a funding base that is larger than the traditional funding base. We need to build a constituency of voters that needs to be far, far bigger, that then can go in to a congressman's office and say, your job is in danger because we're here. Until we have that bigger boat, it's going to be, you know, we're going to be in danger of drowning.
I totally agree. And so what is the media's role in this, getting the word out, helping to, obviously you're on it. And, you know, you've got some filmmakers that are making great documentaries and full feature films. But, you know, it's hard to break through right now because so much of what you see and read is focused on, the divide in this country and focused on politics. What would you like to see happen?
The irony is that because of what you just said, the coverage of stranger danger has decreased on cable news and all that, because it's filled up with Trump and filled up with the election and now with the virus. So, 10 years ago, you couldn't turn on cable news without seeing the latest violent act toward a child magnified 1,000 times because of the number of times they repeat it, until people felt that they couldn't let their kids pass the front stoop. Ironically, now that's been replaced by different kinds of fears. I've thought a lot about journalism. I spent my life as a journalist. I'm not sure what I am now, but I like to still think like a journalist. I was talking to a fellow journalist last night, and I said, I really miss hanging out with my fellow reporters at the newspaper. And this person agreed and said, reporters, journalists, they're kind of wacky. You walk into the newsroom and there's all that energy, and they're kind of goofy people. And I said, yeah, I know, God, I miss that. And the reason they're goofy, I said, is because anybody that looks at an issue and realizes there's actually 5 sides to that issue is going to be goofy, because it's confusing. Right now, you have journalism looking only at the eyeballs that look back at it. You have things measured by how many views. You don't have things measured by how fair that report was. To me, objectivity has never been the issue. Fairness has always been the issue. It's very difficult to be objective. It's kind of abstract. Fairness, you can make a fairly good judgment on whether you've been fair in a story. The other element there that I've always felt is that you can't stop with the problem. You have to spend, I believe, at least a third, probably a half of the reporting you do, say on a television or newspaper series or online writing, on solutions. Not just one solution, but solutions that come from all 5 of those ways of looking at this issue. Journalism, I wish it was better right now than it is. But those 2 principles, I think, are at the core of what needs to happen, is to look at things from more than 2 views, and to try as best as we can to be fair, and to write about and report on solutions, not just the latest wrist-slashing problem.
Well, our Gen Z is getting a lot of their information, not the way that we do, by watching television and the regular channels. They're getting it from, social media, from being on their devices, and that information is being manipulated and keeps them addicted. And anyway, I hope we can get kids, to find that balance that you've been talking about, get them out into nature, and just make it available and accessible and safe for all, something you've advocated for, and critically important. We have a couple of other questions. Speaking of relationships to wild animals, can this niche be filled, at least in part, by zoos and aquariums, or are you thinking specifically about wild encounters outside of these human curated spaces?
I have a chapter in Our Wild Calling about zoos and aquaria. And obviously it's an ambivalent area. I have a very good friend who's very active in the True Nature movement, Ron Swaisgood. He works for the San Diego Zoological Society. He's the guy, along with some Chinese scientists, that is credited with saving the giant panda from extinction. He works for a zoo, or a zoological society. He and I have had long talks about this. The zoos are changing. They need to change even faster. And I make the case in this that they need to be as concerned about the animals in the environment around the zoo, in the bioregion in which that zoo is, as they are with the animals that are inside that zoo, as they are with the panda in China or the tiger in Asia. They need to be really responsive to the bioregions that are there. And some of them have started encouraging family nature clubs. You know, they're using the zoo as a place to encourage these groups of families that band together to go experience nature with their kids, not in the zoo, but out in the mountains and beyond, and in the urban cities too. So it's an ambivalent area, but I also make the case, you know, a lot has been learned by zoos about people and other animals living close together or being close together. There are some lessons there, I think, that could be really interesting for the design of future cities.
In some cases, it's the only connection to these animals that that people will ever have. And like you say, you have to know and understand nature to be able to want to save it, protect it, restore it. And like you say, that nature's aquariums and zoos do have a lot of, you know, great programs, and they do need to continue to evolve, especially, you know, focused on animal rights, but we won't get into that at the moment. I've got another really saucy, questionable question. Toward creating greener cities and more equitable societies, other than education, which sectors do you think need seeding the most?
I think I mentioned one of them, which is it's not really a sector, but jobs. You know, that mechanism that gets a kid from 8th grade all the way through school to a point where that kid can get a job connecting people to nature. And the place to, you know, one of the first speeches I gave after the book came out, after Last Child came out, 2005, Cheryl Charles arranged, and it was at the National Conservation Training Center. And there was a lot of concern at the training center in West Virginia of all these conservation organizations in the government that were there about the fact that baby boomers were going to start retiring soon. Who was going to replace them? And did these kids have any connection to nature? And secondly, about diversity. You know, future forest rangers were not going to look like America. That was 15 years ago, and there was real concern about that. But I remember asking, you know, what have you done to recruit kids from, you know, schools where most of the kids don't look like me? And they said, well, we've put up notices. You know, we've put out brochures or sent the schools notices. You know, said, I'm sorry, but pinning a card to the bulletin board isn't going to do it. I don't know how much of this is going on right now in that sector. But it seems to me that we ought to go in, that these conservation organizations, environmental organizations, education, as we say, environmental education, ought to be recruiting kids of different races and different backgrounds early, showing them that there's a possibility of a job someday that has meaning, that has deep meaning. And then following them through, as I said, as they go through school, and then making sure that they get the money to go to college to become a person who works in some kind of nature-related field. I guess that's one that comes to mind.
Zach Pine has asked a question. Can you speak to the role of Congress, the judicial branch, and the executive branch in this work? For example, the Trump administration's order to open public lands to coal leasing is the subject of a lawsuit. With the current political and judicial situation, public lands are at risk, as are many of the ideas that you have brought up, such as the green jobs and natural practices.
Yeah, this is political, whether we like to talk about it or not. And the prior administration wasn't perfect, but it did a lot of good things. I mean, the Obama White House adopted something called Every Kid in the Park, and I was invited to go to the announcement of that, and got to meet Obama and thank him. And that guaranteed that every fourth grader in America would get a free year-long pass, including their families, free to any federal lands or waters, parks, national parks and national forests and so on, any place that charges a fee. A case can be made that no fee should be charged, but that's another issue. Lots of good things have been done in both, believe it or this was at least a bipartisan issue. Under Bush, the Secretary of the Interior, Dirk Kempthorne, really cared about the issue of children and nature. Now, I probably didn't agree with him on a whole lot of environmental decisions, but he was deeply committed to this. He felt it because of his background, and he did some good things. Then Obama came in. Sally Jewell, Secretary of Interior under Obama, did a lot of great things. And just because it looks bad right now doesn't mean it has to look bad in a few months. These next few months are going to be difficult, to say the least. But we have to get past this point. We can't end up. I told somebody today, I grew up in the area of bloody Kansas, in the border wars between Kansas and Missouri. First on the Missouri side, then on the Kansas side. My grandmother's house, where I spent my first few years, was right across the river from Jesse James' house. And I never understood what some of the terms meant when I was growing up. I didn't understand what Little Dixie meant. I heard it, but the schools didn't talk about it. What Little Dixie was the slave trade that had come up the Mississippi River, crossed over to the Missouri, then come all the way up to the Kansas City area. And it was just as much Mississippi as Mississippi. And Jesse James' family, even though they were a poor family, had 8 slaves. The reason I bring that up is that during that period, 10 years before the official war, Civil War started, people were at war in that area. The bushwhackers were slave owning or sympathizing with slavery. Bandits, including Jesse James, guerrillas, militias, who were going over into Kansas and attacking the people, the Free Staters, the people who were against slavery. Many of them had moved there specifically so that Kansas would remain a free state from Massachusetts. Terrible bloodletting, terrible. It was Bosnia. It was terribly personal, and it was in some ways more. We don't know about that. I didn't know about that as a kid, growing up right there. I fear that right now, the far extremes on all 5 sides of this are making us more vulnerable to that kind of outcome that precedes something much larger, potentially. We're already seeing that. You know, I still believe, and I hope it's still true, that connecting kids to nature is one of the few issues that will bring us together, conservative, liberal, whatever the religion, whatever the race, whatever the economic background. This is a tool that we can use for good in many ways. But we can't allow this slide, you know, into brother against brother. It's happened before in this country.
So I have just a few more things to ask you that I'm wanting to hear you talk about. Your thoughts on rights of nature being one, and then also how can we help you besides buying your books and sharing our reviews on social media, our encouragement to our friends, and obviously engaging with Children in Nature Network. How can we, how can we be helpful to you? And also, what are your top solutions that we can do in our top 3 or 4 that could be most beneficial for nature and exposing our kids to nature? And should we be calling our city council members? Should we be writing our Congress people?
I think that all of the above, of course. But there's some fundamental tectonic shifts that need to happen that we can help make happen. The more accurate question is, how can I help you? The people who are listening here at the conference. How can some of us, like me, help you? I've always said that there's 2 kinds of people in the world: people who do and people who write about people who do. Many of the people at this conference are people who do. So how can we help you? That's one of the questions, answers to that question. Another one, I think, is to recognize in ourselves as individuals and as a species how desperately lonely we are. This epidemic, which the medical field has been talking about now for about a decade, is huge. Human loneliness now, as I said earlier, ranks with smoking and obesity as a cause of early death. Human isolation. And now we're in a pandemic. At the same time of this epidemic of human loneliness, we're in a pandemic in which we're isolated in our homes and will be for a while. I make the case that there are a lot of reasons for this human loneliness. We can blame Facebook all we want, but I think it's rooted in an even deeper loneliness, which is our loneliness as a species. The more nature deficit disorder we allow to spread, the lonelier we get. We are desperate as a species not to feel alone in the universe. Why else would we look for Bigfoot? Why else would we look for life, intelligent life on other planets, when Stephen Hawking warns us it may not be a good idea to find that life? It's because we're desperately alone. We don't want to be alone in the universe. There are religious implications to that, of course. But the irony is that we're not alone. We're surrounded by a great conversation in that older language that I mentioned, of not only animals, but of trees. The more science knows about communication right outside our window, the more we realize that there's a great whisper there. There's a great conversation, and we're part of it if we pay attention. And that relieves our loneliness. It's one of the reasons that nature seems to have become so much more important to people during the pandemic. And then finally, ultimately, we need to see this not as a nice to have, this connection to nature, but a have to have. This is fundamental to who we are. This is fundamental to our health, our cognitive health, our children's health, the health of all species. It's fundamental. Anything that fundamental to our humanity needs to be seen as what it is, which is it is a human right. It's a civil right, and it's a human right. When you look at the neighborhoods that have the least nature in them and the most toxic dumps, the mortality rate, early mortality, is so much higher than in green neighborhoods. This is literally a matter of life and death. This is not a nice to have. This is a human right. Now, some progress has been made. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, in 2012, with some help from Cheryl Charles and others with the Children Nature Network, passed a resolution that said children have a human right to a connection with nature and to a healthy natural environment. Only when we begin to think about this issue, our issue, in those terms, will it be taken seriously. Will politicians stop patting it on its head and sending it on its way? This is a human right. I think that's kind of the bottom line for me.
Well, I just want to start by saying thank you for all that you do for humanity, for animals, to inspire us to become a healthier, more whole society, and functional, emotionally sound. And I just wish we could clone Rich Louv and have, I swear, some people are worth cloning, and you are definitely one of them. And I very much look forward to the rest of this amazing conference that was spun off by C&NN. And I just also want to thank Sarah Milligan-Toffler and Laura and the rest of C&NN's amazing staff who have just pulled a big friggin' rabbit out of the hat. It's like magic that you were able to rise to the occasion during this horrific pandemic. And like I said before, I hope that next year we can all be in Atlanta together. And there's nothing like, being there physically and emotionally together under one roof. And I look forward to hosting you in my hometown. What's the date, Laura?
We are working on those plans right now, Laura, but we will be there in 2022, I think is the plan. And we'll be sharing some news with everyone attending the summit, hopefully yet this week, about how we're going to still engage and move this work forward over the coming year. It may not be in person. It would have been the first week of June in 2021 in your hometown of Atlanta. And I don't know that any of us will be pulling together 1,000-person live events in less than a year. So stay tuned, Children of Nature Movement. We will keep everyone informed. And we really do look forward to coming to Atlanta and to be with all of you in person. I just want to thank you, Laura Turner Seydel, and you, Richard Louv. What an incredible, moving, thought-provoking, thoughtful, an incredible virtual Trailside chat we've just had. We're really grateful. If you aren't familiar with all of Rich's books, they're all amazing. If you're not familiar with Laura's foundation, the Captain Planet Foundation, please check it out. These are two people who are doing work to make the world better every single day. And we're really grateful for your time and your engagement tonight. I have just a couple of quick reminders for anyone who's still on the line with us. And we've had such a wonderful turnout tonight. If you are participating in an action area, they go live tomorrow at noon Central Time. If you're here joining us tonight on our Summit Highlights ticket, there are activities for you as well tomorrow. You can join the action area report outs and our final networking reception. You guys can find all of the links for these in our Whova app that I think everyone's pretty familiar with, but reach out to our help desk or to any of us on staff if you have any issues or problems. And again, really our deepest thanks and gratitude to Laura and Richard. Thank you so much for a beautiful evening.